With just about every writer I've ever worked with, at some point they start doubting themselves and they start saying, why will anyone care about my story? My book, I don't even think it's interesting enough. Some tips on how to get past this coming up. It happens to just about every writer I know. At some point in the process of writing their memoir, I get the question from them, why will anyone care about this? My life is so boring. This is a stupid thing I'm doing. Why did I think I could do this? Why did I think anyone would care about my life? So this question usually takes me by surprise because it often comes from my smartest, best writers. I had a writer and she was working on this book about this spiritual journey she took. And it was hysterically funny. It was one of the best books I ever worked on. And she came to me and said, Wendy, I just feel so down about my book. I feel like no one is ever going to read this book. Who really cares? Then I had another client who surprised me as well. And she's working on a book about her family's friendship with Ronald and Nancy Reagan. And she came to me and she said, Wendy, you have to talk me off of a ledge because I feel like this book has no reason to exist. Who really cares? Again, I was very surprised when she said that to me. I had another client who's working on this book. It's about taking care of her aging parents. And the prose is so beautiful. It's so literary. It's so affecting. She writes, her prose is like poetry. And she says, I just don't know who would care about my book. And all of these readers really took me by surprise because these were books that I was in love with. I couldn't believe how beautifully written they were, how interesting they were. Yet these writers were filled with self-doubt. The truth is that self-doubt is often part of the process of writing your memoir. The problem is that you will never be objective about your own book. You will never know what it's like to read your book for the first time because you've practically memorized it at a certain point. You know what's going to happen, so there's no sense of surprise. You know the next sentence that's going to be on the page. You don't have the experience of reading your book, so you're not emotionally affected by it. So because you aren't able to be objective about your own book, what do? You ask your friends and family and they say, oh, I love your book. It's amazing. I love the part where Aunt Gladys, tosses the flowers across the room. It's a great scene. And then you tell yourself, well, they're just saying that because they don't want to hurt my feelings. They don't really love my book. Or the other thing you say to yourself is, oh, they love me. Of course they love my book. But you don't take this feedback seriously. So the feedback you get from friends and people who love you may not always be the best feedback to get. So then they get themselves into a writing group, they get themselves a writing coach, and they get good feedback. And people say, wow, your writing really affected me. I really love the way you express yourself. I love that story about your grandfather. And yet these writers still question themselves. And I think, yeah, well, they're just saying that. You know what? But why will anyone really care about my story? I'm going to tell you a secret about writing. People love a memoir, not because it tells them a fascinating story and is filled with plot twists and turns. They love a memoir because it speaks to them. I'll talk about how to make your memoir speak to a reader later on in this video. For now, I wanted to give you some examples of books that did really well critically and were well received commercially. So they were commercial and critical successes. And I want to give you a description of their plot. Basically, what I want you to notice is that there are so many memoirs out there about really everyday subjects. Let me give you some examples. So the premise of this book is a girl grows up in a small town in Southeast Texas where people are plagued by mental health issues and alcoholism. Does that sound like a fascinating book? I don't know. Not really. Do you know what? This is the description of The Liars Club by Mary Karr, one of the best critically received memoirs of all time, considered a classic in its genre. Let me give you another example. A man cares for his dying father. Okay, such an everyday story. Unfortunately, so many of us have to go through grief. And this is by Philip Roth, one of the most respected writers of all time. It's called Patrimony. A boy grows up poor in Ireland. Sounds quite everyday. You might say, oh, well, he was poor and I didn't have financial problems, but that's not the point. The point is that you have your own trials that you went through in your childhood. Growing up poor in Ireland, the famous book, Angela's Ashes. So then there are memoirs that are so successful that they were made into movies. This is a memoir about, I adopted a Labrador retriever. Like, could you come up with a topic that is any more commonplace than that? And that's Marley and Me. Super box office success. Then there's a movie about a woman who wanted to make the recipes of Julia Child for a year. Julie and Julia. Yeah, again, like she's cooking. Like, what could be more boring than that, really? So then we have the premise: a father deals with his son's meth abuse. And this is from the movie Beautiful Boy. So you might say to me, well, Wendy, Julie and Julia, I didn't even like that book. I felt like it was superficial. And I will say to you, yes, you're not going to like all of the books on this list. But when Meryl Streep comes knocking on your door and says, hi, I'd like to be in the movie based on your book, believe me, you're going to be happy about it. Your goal is not to write a book that everyone loves. Your goal is to write a book that some people love. That's the best that any book can hope for. No one book is going to appeal to the entire population. So let me talk to you about what makes a reader love your book. Now, some books have an amazing plot. The great majority of memoirs actually don't. But what makes people care is when you let them inside. The way you let someone inside is your prose. You need to be subjective in your prose. You need to be internal. You need to write down not only what you saw and heard, you have to write down what you thought. So I talk a lot about this in other videos. Anytime I do a video on prose, I always talk about being subjective and putting us inside your head. So look for those videos to get a better sense of what I'm talking about and to get more information on how to make your prose internal. For now, just understand that the way to make someone care about your story is to put them there with you. And the way to put them there with you in the story is to put them inside your head, to write down your thoughts on paper. The great majority of your prose should actually be internal. It should actually consist of your thoughts. So it doesn't matter if you're writing a book about your golden retriever or your divorce or your trip to Thailand. The point is, if you make people care about you, they will care about your book. Good writing begins by affecting your reader emotionally. Readers actually don't stick with a book because the plot is so amazing. They stick with it because they're affected emotionally. That's why people read books. They want to have an emotional experience. And the way for you to give that to them is to put your thoughts down on paper, to let them think the same things that you thought at the time. So obviously you won't remember exactly what you thought at the time. This is an emulation of that. Put your thoughts down on paper, be subjective, and you will give your reader what they're looking for. Doubting yourself is part of the process, but don't give in to it. I know some people and they feel like they deserve to doubt themselves. So it feels like they intentionally give into that self-doubt and they intentionally punish themselves. So don't do that. If you're going to doubt yourself, fine. But get past it. Don't give into it. It will waste your time and your energy. And this is energy and time that you could spend putting words down on the page. Stop focusing on what some hypothetical reader will think. Instead, you should focus on what you have to say.